Hi, this is Saleha reporting for World Bites. I'm here in the studio with Dave Bowden from the Institute of Ideas. The Institute of Ideas launched the 21 Pledges for Progress in the run-up to the UK general elections, and Dave is here to explain more about these.
So there are 21 pledges which you can put to your prospective parliamentary candidate and ask them how many of them they sign up to, how many of them they agree with, which are the values which they really hold dear to them. And we think that if they support 15 of these, it doesn't matter necessarily which 15, then they might be worth considering voting for, as it would demonstrate that they have some semblance of principle and that they have a vision for society they want to try and achieve.
Okay, in the pledges you identify 4 main areas of freedom, constitution, economic development and public services. Why these areas in particular?
Well, partly because these are all aspects to which we hold quite important towards building a more progressive future, actually having an impact in the world and being able to improve our circumstances. There's an awful lot of them which are also quite carefully interlinked, actually, when we start to put them down onto paper. So as well as the more obvious freedoms, such as around free speech, freedom of association, freedom of protest that we've seen clampdowns on, we also think there have been curbs on freedoms which have been a much more insidious way, things that people don't even really consider as being political questions, such as around the smoking ban, for example, and also CRB checks. We think there's actually something quite pernicious about the way in which you have to ask permission from the state if you want to work with young people. You have to have a piece of paper that validates you in the eyes of the state, saying that I'm not a paedophile simply for working with young people. We think that creates quite an atmosphere of mistrust, particularly between generations, and that is as much a freedom question as a more obvious one around free speeches.
I'd just like to pick up on a few of the pledges and get your thoughts on them, because it would seem that under freedom, for example, you've got quite a few pledges there that some MPs would support. Scrapping the DNA database, on police power of detention, as well as holding a referendum on the EU constitution, and even Boris Johnson would support the amnesty for so-called illegal immigrants. And alongside that you have some more challenging and what we here at World Right would consider more important policy ideas, such as repealing hate speech laws and advocating open borders. So can you tell me about your take on these two issues?
Well, one of the reasons we've tried to put together these pledges is that we actually have a degree of faith there are still people involved in politics today who do have certain values and certain principles. We want to use these pledges partly to find areas of agreement. As I say, that's why we're asking them to sign up to 15 pledges. But we also don't just want to try and seek a nice, happy consensus and a middle ground. So we've also included more difficult questions, as you say, around campaigning for open borders. I mean, I remember seeing Nick Griffin on Question Time, where you had all of the 3 main parties lining up together to say, well, Nick Griffin's a racist and we wouldn't support him, you shouldn't vote for him, you should vote for us, and then all competed against each other to see who could have the more tougher immigration controls. We think in that climate it is important to try and find the people who would at least support even the very basic amnesty level. But at the same time, we're also very aware of the fact that often people will consider that a compromise. So they will say, let's have an amnesty on illegal immigrants, but at the same time, let's then use that as a launch pad to try and prevent more illegal immigrants coming in and clamping down on the immigration controls. So we thought that in terms of trying to create a space in the public sphere for that kind of argument, that it was useful to have something which was perhaps sort of slightly easier to settle on, but at the same time, if you support an amnesty on illegal immigrants, then why try and turn away more of them every day? Why have ever tougher border controls? It's a way of starting an argument with people and to start a debate in the public sphere, which is currently not being had at all. Around hate speech, putting curbs on free speech doesn't make bad thoughts go away, really, and in many ways all it does is encourage people to sort of shift the sort of language they're doing, feeling like they have to watch what they say rather than actually having a free and open argument. But we do feel that actually state-enforced legislation equality is actually a curb on people's freedom of association. So it is right that people should be able to decide if they don't want to deal with certain ethnic groups, people relating to their sexuality. They should be their choice, particularly relating to their belief, they should be free to not include people in various clubs and societies they want to do. And then it's our job to challenge these viewpoints which we consider reactionary.
And to win the argument.
Exactly. And you can't have those with, sort of state, laws and regulations which prevent people from speaking freely, engaging with each other freely, and actually taking on these arguments, as they are in the real world.
Now, I'm quite interested on your point on the Constitution, where you advocate the abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords in the interest of an elected legislature or an executive. Are you advocating an elected second tier? Because I can't see how that would expand democracy. I mean, why wouldn't we just simply abolish both the House of Lords and the monarchy and have an elected House of Commons?
Well, I mean, that's very much what I would support. One of the reasons why I think we should abolish both the House of Lords and the monarchy is that I think that it's very much a relic of an old idea that people cannot organise themselves as a sovereign nation and have control over themselves. Having said that, within a context at the moment where we feel that very much the sovereignty of Parliament is under attack, so as we've seen around the MP's expenses scandal, we've had this rush for regulators to come in to monitor the pay. We don't trust our elected representatives at the moment. So currently I think the battle is to try and actually argue for the merits of having democratically elected representatives. And within that argument, I think you can then put a case for the total abolition of the House of Lords.
On the economy, you argue for directing state expenditure towards infrastructure projects, for nuclear power stations and deregulation of research and development projects. But you don't say anything about the need to stand up for growth as a good thing in and of itself. Why is that?
We think that standing up for growth simply as a rhetorical device is something which is quite easy, and even though that we know that there are a lot of anti-growth sentiments around today, a lot of the people who we know who would put those arguments would still actually argue for growth in quite a low sort of way, admittedly, but they still say we want lots more growth. But they will also say, but we want it to be sustainable, we want it to be something which has a limited impact on the planet, and so on. And actually, as anyone who knows anything about the sort of situation we're in terms of economic growth, actually that's not what the world needs. Everyone needs more economic growth. The most powerful ways in that's going to happen, the way in which you're actually going to achieve real growth, not just as this sort of slightly kind of nice sort of woolly concept, but in the way in which you're actually going to make lives better, is by building more roads, by providing ourselves with cheaper, more efficient energy supplies, allowing people greater freedom to live their lives. Better housing is something as well. People, I think, don't really realise the extent to which regulation really curbs the ability to build more houses. We've seen a sort of massive property bubble. A lot of people have said we don't want to go back to the days of financial speculation and property bubbles. A lot of the times around immigration, for example, people will say, we're only a small island, we can't allow many people into it. Actually, we can allow plenty more people in if we're prepared to build the houses. Making these arguments for expenditure on infrastructure are things that we all know we need. No one would look at the infrastructure of the UK at the moment and say, well, this is the best that we can do. It's also more than simply just replacing stock. It's not just that we want newer trains, for example. We want more train lines, which requires a lot of long-term planning, a lot of long-term upheaval, being prepared to build on areas which are currently restricted. But overall, that will enable us to have a kind of society which is more dynamic, allows for much more growth. So actually having that more specific, more detailed argument, we're not putting forward a specific policy, we're not saying we should be putting X amount of millions into doing this. But actually, by making these arguments, we are standing up for growth as a good thing, because there's no way you would argue for that level of expenditure at a time of serious financial hardship for the government, unless you felt that growth was a very important thing.
On the public services, you've got 5 important pledges on directing state funding, on reducing bureaucratic control and standing up for knowledge, the arts and education for their own sake rather than for specific outcomes. But you say nothing about people's jobs and livelihoods in the public sector or certain services that people are quite concerned to protect. Why is that?
Well, partly at the moment, despite all of the discussion we've had about cuts and the inevitability of cuts, none of the parties have actually been quite specific over where those cuts are going to occur, particularly in the public sector. So it's very difficult to then start saying, well, we don't want to take any cuts at all, that there should be no changes in people's jobs or what it is they should be doing. Because although I would defend the right of any worker to to go out and protest and defend their standard of living, at the same time there are plenty of jobs in government at the moment which I don't think are particularly worth having. I mean, I think one of the most striking examples I saw was as soon as the financial crisis hit and you had lots of people being put out of work, you had 21,000 therapists being recruited by the government to try and help these people through the difficult time. Now, I don't think those people actually needed those therapists to come in and sort of ask them to share their pain and tell them why they're upset about being out of work. Actually, they need the investment to come in for them to have new jobs. That would be the biggest thing you could do to improve people's well-being and so on. So ultimately, I think that those therapists perhaps don't need to be in the jobs they're doing. I think the questions we have to ask ourselves very importantly at this point is actually what are the values that we have from the public sector. Why is it that we think that certain professions and certain values are best served by the state? And the problem is that some of those are not just a straightforward matter of financial services or investment. So we've seen a large amount of investment going into universities over the last few years during the boom times. But at the same time, what many would regard as a hollowing out of what a university is for. They've felt more and more pressure to perform an economic role. In fact, that's something they've had to cave into quite recently as a result of the cut. Education is for preparing people for a broader, more inquisitive view of the world, which you can't necessarily tick on a box on a research assessment to say that this is valuable knowledge, but is actually something which is very important. Similarly, in healthcare, there are a lot of people worrying about cuts within the NHS and saying that either the Tories are going to cut this or Labour are going to do this. I mean, actually, what's striking about all of the parties is they're all promising to ring fence the NHS, but all of them support increasing invasions of people's private lives in the form of preventative medicine. So more people sort of saying you should be drinking less, you should be eating less, be encouraged to exercise more, so you're not so much of a drain on the health system. Now, I think that if you're going to fight for a public health system, you do that because you want to treat sick people and you don't care how they got sick, but you're going to offer them the treatment and make them healthy. The problem is that in the current climate, particularly around the election campaign, because it seems like politics goes on holiday a little bit, because everyone is made their points in their manifestos. They don't want to get caught out. They don't want to have a real political argument in any way. And so people having these very managerial discussions around public services in terms of how much investment they're going to be doing, but no one's actually challenging a lot of the directions public services have been going into, and saying, well, actually, I don't think that's something we should be supporting. It's also, worth making the case that some of these cuts aren't necessarily inevitable. There are ways in which we can cut our debt, which aren't simply by cutting back on services. If we actually have economic growth, then we don't have to accept cuts actually as simply as an inevitable debate. So we want sort of politicians to be a little bit more honest, to actually be prepared to stand up for what they think. They're forever asking us what we think. They constantly want to have polls that say the public think we should be doing this. There's no sort of sense that the sort of politicians have a kind of vision for society that they want to put in, and that's what we're trying to drag out with these pledges. I found it very striking at the recent TUC demo in London, where you had all of these different public sector workers coming together, a lot of unions, all protesting against cuts. And the one thing you found when you were speaking to people was they said that this is not a political thing. We just, we want to stand up against cuts. We're not interested in party politics. Well, of course, actually, that's what the real lifeblood of politics is trying to work out what kind of society you're going to build, what kind of public sector, what kind of hospitals do you want, what kind of schools do you want. So I think that's the sort of thing that really needs to be challenged a lot around this election. There are aspects of life which are somehow detached from politics, or that they're somehow made grubby by having the involvement of politics and argument in there.
On the actual act of voting, there are many young people, including myself, who probably aren't going to vote in these elections. And I've met some volunteers here at WorldRat, as well as other people I know who support white voting, or what we know here in Britain as spoiling your vote. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that people shouldn't vote out of a sense of duty. I think you often hear a lot of the kind of rhetoric that people, fought and died to have the vote, so therefore you must vote. Now, the reason why people fought and died for the vote in the past was because it really meant something. It allowed them to have a stake in society and to try and, sort of create a vision for society. And to elect people who represented them. That was also one of the reasons why they had to fight for it, because also there were groups who recognised they didn't want to have certain groups to have the vote, because that would challenge the status quo of society. I would always argue in the past for people not to have to vote because they simply feel they should do. Actually, there's a good reason to be apathetic today, that there are certain things that you violently disagree with which they would stand for as a matter of course. So I don't think that you necessarily have to accept what going to the ballot box is, where you essentially give somebody the validation to rule over you, to be your elected representative. I don't think that's something that's given lightly. I think at the same time, simply going along and saying, well, simply because people aren't representing me, that therefore politics isn't for me. That's not something that I want to engage in. It doesn't speak to me personally. It doesn't represent my identity, my particular likes and dislikes. Simply just going along and saying, well, I'm not going to vote for any of you, I'm just going to make this protest, is actually quite hollow. All you're doing is taking yourself out from the electoral process. Now, if you think there's nothing worth fighting for in this election, as I say, we've done these pledges so that we can actually try and seek out those politicians and those principles which we do think are worth fighting for. You also have to accept that politics doesn't begin and end at the ballot box.
Right.
So the question you're going to ask, if you don't want to vote for anyone at this election, if you can't find anyone who is worth bestowing your vote on, then you don't have to go along and do that. But what are you going to do to try and fight for these principles? These things are important. There are going to be decisions made by the government, whether they're Labour, Conservative or Lib Dem, which are going to have huge ramifications. And it's always within the power of the people to challenge that, to hold their elected representatives to account, and actually to try and build a better world. And I don't think you're going to achieve that simply by saying, let's, none of the above, I think.
Yeah, by registering your discontent.
Exactly.
And it also turns the democratic process into quite a technical process, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in a lot of other countries, you've seen increasing moves towards compulsory voting. The very idea that you're forced in this free society to, give a vote to somebody, regardless of whether you think they're worth voting for or not, I think is, a very disturbing route to go down.
Yeah.
And I think it's also a cheap way out for, particularly political elites who can't work out why people aren't voting for them, who can't work out why people aren't interested in what they have to say. So they simply assume, well, it must be because they're lazy or they're apathetic, rather than actually having that debate over what's going on in politics today. Why have we got this sort of sense of cynicism and discontent around? What can we do to change this? It allows a simple way out to say, well, we'll have 90% votes, we'll have the full support of the people, but it will be meaningless.
Yeah. And what sort of response have you been getting to these pledges?
We've had an awful lot of people who have signed up to it so far and actually given us quite a strong response. And the one thing they often say is, well, it's actually nice during the election campaigns to not just sit there and kind of sort of shout at the telly, or to just grumble when the local candidate comes canvassing, but actually to engage in a real political discussion, which is not something you're going to be getting, I think, from the leadership debates. Is much vaunted leadership debates. It's not going to be something you're going to get from the likes of Question Time, where everything is going to be very stage managed. Everyone's going to be very careful of what they're saying. This, people really responding to the fact that they've been asked about principles, and they're actually being asked about the kind of big stuff of politics, which everyone assumes that is not discussed anymore, simply for a managerial policy.
Thanks, Dave. There are some great pledges in here, well worth the read and to support. Send them to your MPs and challenge them on some of the issues. You can read the pledges online on the Institute of Ideas website on www.iidea.org. instituteofideas.com/election 2010.